Facebook's working. Okay. Okay. Okay, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Okay. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to another one of our wonderful Chabad of Montana lecture series. Tonight, we are honored to have with us Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Pereira, who's going to address the topic of the Iberian Marrano Jews, a story of survival against all odds. Rabbi Dr. Pereira is originally from Lisbon, Portugal, though he's been in the United States with his wife Elisheva since 1982 and lives in Richmond, Virginia. He loves, as you saw in his bio, he has a passion for Judaic studies and for economics, but he also has an incredible passion for the history of the Jews, particularly those on the Iberian Peninsula. And so, without further ado, although he's in Portugal, I did not know he was going to be in Portugal, but he is in Portugal where it's right now 2 o'clock in the morning, or 2 o'clock in the morning. He's joining us here in Montana. We're at 7 p.m. and he's gonna rock our minds and stimulate us with incredible Jewish history. Rabbi Pereira, can you hear us?
Yes, thank you so much.
Take it away.
It's an absolutely delight to be with Chabad of Montana and all its audience. And indeed, I'll be sharing some, I believe, fascinating information about the Iberian Marrano Jews. To get things started, maybe the best way to start really is to say that if you were to go to Portugal today, if you were to come to Portugal, and if you were to visit a Jewish community of Belmont, this is a community in the northern area of the country. It's one of the very few communities in the country, Jewish communities, of course. And if you were to go to Belmont today, you would find a rather ordinary Jewish community. You would find a synagogue. It's the picture on your right, Beit Eliyahu. You would find a mikveh. You would find some kosher stores. You would find the Jewish center. You would find the Jewish hotel and the bookstores. Again, it would be pretty normal. But the thing that is fascinating about it is that this ordinary looking Jewish community, there is absolutely nothing ordinary about it. Actually, the fact that you go there and you would see everything that you would be seeing that looks so normal, that in and of itself is truly extraordinary. And what I want to share with you is exactly this idea of how is it possible that you have a community that can actually trace its origins all the way back to the times of the expulsion and the Inquisition. And although, if we go back for a second, it's not the only Jewish community in Portugal, we have another community in Lisbon, but this is a community, well, recent by some standards. I mean, it comes from the late 1800s or so. We have a community in Porto, which is even more recent, really became back to life over the last 10 years or so. We have Chabad in Cascais now, but that's again started in 2010. And Belmont has been in one way or another there for quite some time. And so again, what I want to share with you is how this ordinary looking Jewish community is truly extraordinary. Tell you a little bit about the story, and I'll do that in essentially, let's call it 3 acts. I'll share with you a little bit about the Spanish and Portuguese expulsions and the uniqueness in particular of the Portuguese expulsion of 1497. That explains a lot of why it was possible, the survival of some underground communities to the 20th century, all the way to the 20th century. And then in the second act, I'll talk a little bit, very briefly, about the Sephardic diaspora that follows these expulsions, and focus a little bit more on Jewish survival in Portugal. What were the circumstances that made it possible for Jewish survival in Portugal? And finally, we'll come back to our days, and I will talk a little bit about the first Marrano revival in the 1920s, which was in and of itself a miracle, and even more so, the second Marrano revival in the late 1980s, which I was blessed to participate personally in that endeavor, and basically coming to our days and see how it's possible to come full circle. Now, before we even start addressing the issues, one of the questions that I'm always asked, and it's important to clarify from the get-go, is what the term Marrano means, and specifically for those people that are a little bit more familiar with the term, why would I use that term? So, first of all, what is a Marrano? A Marrano is someone who was forcibly converted to Christianity and has to openly live a Christian life, but has in some way attempts to follow underground some Jewish traditions. And this, I realize, is a vague definition, but we have to understand that if the first generation of people that were forcibly converted already still knew a lot about Judaism, when you start getting 2, 3, 4, 5 generations, you know very little. And we have that experience also, for example, with the Jews in the Soviet Union, the former Soviet Union. So these are people that have to live a double life. Now, today, there is a lot of conversation and a lot of discussion, especially in the internet, about the Bnei Anusim, the children of the Anusim, or the crypto Jews, and so forth. Well, the truth of the matter is that these communities, in particular in the Iberian Peninsula, they just refer to themselves as Jews, but if they had to say something else, they would say Marrano Jews. That's the way they refer to themselves. So I'm using Iberian Marrano Jews exactly because that's the way the people that I know refer to themselves. The question is pertinent because the term for Marrano has lots of different meanings, and there are lots of conjectures about the origin of that term. But one thing that we know for sure is that the term is mostly, or has been mostly historically, used in a derogatory way. So some of the origins that can justify individually or altogether the term Marrano are first the Arabic Muharram, that means something that's forbidden, and of course we understand that they have to do things that were forbidden. In Portuguese, in Old Portuguese and Spanish, Marrano is a term that refers to either pig or pork, so you can understand how that's a derogatory term. In Portuguese, Galaico-Portuguese medieval, Marrao means also, Marrao, that's a derivative of Marrano, is someone is obstinate. And so again, you can see how that would refer to people that are obstinate in keeping some vestiges of their faith, their ancestral faith, alive. And finally, the most beautiful of all the explanations, which I just give here because it's beautiful, but I don't think it's actually very accurate historically, is that Marrano is just an aggregation of two Hebrew words. As you know, in Hebrew, the word for someone was forced to convert and follows the religion in hiding, the Jewish religion in hiding, is the anusim. The anus is the person that is forced to do something. So anus in modern Hebrew has this connotation of being forced to do something that you really don't like to do. So anusim are the ones that were forced to do things that they don't want to do, namely to follow a different religion. And mar As you know, it's a Hebrew term that means bitter. So they were the Marranusim, the Marranos, meaning the ones that were embittered because they were forced to do things they didn't want. Be it as it may, the term is, as it is understood commonly, it's not a particularly nice term. It's a derogatory term, but it's the term that is used historically by the communities that I'm aware of in Portugal and Spain. So this said, what I would like to do now is to go through the three acts that we mentioned, the three acts that tell us the story, and we have to start from the very beginning, and that's telling you a little bit about the Spanish and Portuguese expulsions of 1492 and 1497. Of course, you can tell me that everybody knows about the Spanish expulsion, maybe, but I can assure you that most people don't know about the Portuguese expulsion, and that's a very important issue in this context, in particular because it was a completely different, was a unique type of expulsion in the Jewish world, for reasons that we'll see in just a little bit. So to put things in perspective, we have to start by understanding that Spain, the Iberian Peninsula in general, by the year 1492, was arguably the center of the Jewish world. This does not mean, of course, that you don't have Jewish presence in other areas. Of course, we have Jewish presence in North Africa, still in Egypt, still in Babylon, but all of those were in decline. And you have a Jewish presence in the lands of Ashkenaz that were just really starting and were actually not in such good shape because of persecutions. So the center, arguably, of the Jewish world in terms of numbers and in terms of the literary output, the creativity, was the Iberian Peninsula. It's difficult for us to understand that now, but it's important to realize that, to try to put ourselves in the frame of what is happening at that time. And of course, with the decree of expulsion of 1492, what we have is a major outflow of refugees from Spain to Portugal. Basically, from 1492 on, the Portuguese Jewish population increased enormously. The estimates now are that the Jewish population of Portugal about after 1492 was about 200,000 people. There were literally hundreds of Jewish communities all over the country. And 200,000 people was not a small number by any standard. It was about 20% of the Portuguese population of the time. So quantitatively, with the inflow of the Spanish Jewry, the refugees, we have an enormously strong presence that was already strong before, mind you, but I mean, before was about 7-8% of the population, so it was nothing to sneeze about. But now it's not 7 or 8%. Now it's about 20% with everything that implies. So it's a quantitative impact that is enormous in the country. And it's a qualitative impact because we have to understand that the refugees from Spain, and of course, this is not the time to get into the history of that, but the refugees of Spain were really the cream of the crop of Spanish Jewry. Spanish Jewry have been under attack already for over 100 years. There have been massive efforts to convert the Jewish population in Spain, which means that, again, the people that were left at this stage and were expelled at this stage, these were the strongest components of Spanish Jewry. These were the strongest families, the ones that were able to resist everything. So it's the cream of the crop. Not only it's the cream of the crop in terms of their strength about Judaism, but it's also the cream of the crop in terms of their intellectual output. So this is a time, for example, you have great luminaries. It's just to give you some examples of just 4 of the many rabbis from Spain that moved to Portugal and settled in Portugal and stayed in Portugal for a while. Rabbi Isaac Aboab, great Talmudic scholar. Rabbi Abraham Saba, one of the greatest commentators of the Torah, Rabbi Abraham Zakutu, who aside from being a great Jewish historian, uh, was actually an enormously important astronomer and mathematician, and more on that in a little bit. Rabbi Isaac Caro, also a great Talmudic scholar of the yeshivas of Toledo. He moved to Portugal, he moved to Porto in particular for a while, and into Lisbon and so forth. And this Rabbi Isaac Caro, if you're recognizing the name, it's for a good reason, because he's the uncle of Rabbi Yosef Caro, who is the author of the Shulchan Aruch, the Code of Jewish Law that we follow to this day. And as a matter of fact, there is more to the story. Rabbi Yosef Caro, according to a lot of records, was born in Lisbon, in Portugal, around this time. And Rabbi Yitzhak Caro, his uncle, ended up, while they were still in Lisbon, apparently, to adopt and really raise his nephew, because his brother died. His brother Eliyahu died. So Rabbi Isaac Caro is a great scholar in his own right, but he's also someone who really educated Rabbi Yosef Caro, and therefore is very much connected to Jewish law and the way we understand Judaism today. So these are great luminaries, and again, just as an example. Now, when I tell you that you have in Portugal a massive Jewish population, not only the Jewish population is massive in number, but it's massive qualitatively in terms of the ability, in terms of their creativity as scholars, as Sophorim, writing manuscripts, and their influence actually in the printing press, in the introduction of the printing press in Portugal and so forth is incredible. We may or may not talk about that in a little bit. So again, this is a paradigm shift for the country and everything. Now, everything is sort of fine, and let's wave our hands a little bit here with the sort of. Of course, when you have so many refugees, you have basically 12 or 13% of the population as refugees. That creates tensions wherever you go. I mean, we realize that. But nevertheless, things were sort of very much under control. However, there was an episode that created ripple effects, and that was the attempt to, in some way, unify through marriage the crowns of Aragon and Castilla on one hand and Portugal on the other hand. Let me give you just a little bit of background for you to see how this works, because this is very important for the continuation of our conversation. In those times, the way countries basically dominated other countries was either conquering them militarily or through a policy of alliances that were mostly marriages. So the Catholic kings, Ferdinando and Isabella of Castilla and Aragon, they were arguably the strongest monarchs in the world at the time. They had several daughters, and they made a policy of betrothing their daughters to kings all over the place, so to speak, as a way of creating in the future a unity and those countries becoming part of the Spanish Empire. And this is, for you to have a reference, this is the time of King Henry VIII, Catherine of Aragon, the first wife and the first victim of Henry VIII, right? She's the daughter, one of the daughters of Ferdinand and Isabella, and she's already somebody that is betrothed under these strategies, in this case of bringing the United Kingdom to what is now the United Kingdom, and was England, into the orbit of Castilla and Aragon. They did that with Portugal. Now, this created a huge problem, because at the time, and we are talking around 1496, around 1496, when they are in these negotiations, one of the most important conditions of the negotiations for this wedding, this marriage, and this alliance to take place was for Portugal to get rid of the Jews. And from the perspective of the Catholic kings, Isabel and Ferdinand, that makes sense because, look, in the Iberian Peninsula, in their part of the Iberian Peninsula, in 1492, they have completely expelled not only the Moors, the Muslims, they defeated the Muslims in Granada, and then when they defeated the Muslims, they expelled the Jews. So by 1492, there was a complete ethnic cleansing of their part of Spain, and they basically wanted Portugal to do the same. So this presents a little bit of a problem because suddenly the King of Portugal has to choose between expelling the Jews or getting into an alliance that is the most important alliance that you can think of politically with Isabel and Ferdinand of Spain, of Aragon and Castile. This is particularly important because at this specific time, 1496, 1497, at this specific time, that's exactly when the Portuguese are engaging, and the Spanish as well, but in this case, the Portuguese are engaging in the maritime exploits that they became so famous for. So this is, think about it, Vasco da Gama, the great Vasco da Gama, the explorer, he left Lisbon in 1497. So this was being prepared already in this time, 1946, 1947. This creates a big problem. It creates a huge problem because the maritime exploits that were about to start depended critically on Jewish support, on the support of Jews specifically. Just to mention a couple of ideas, this is true financially. A lot of the financing of the expeditions, and this is true with the Spanish expeditions, incidentally, but a lot of the expeditions is being financed by Jewish bankers, or, I mean, you didn't really have banking back then as we understand it, but they were financial sponsors. So the Abravanel family, that's a very strong rabbinic family, both in Portugal and in Spain, they were very much behind the Portuguese exploits, financing. Even what they didn't finance directly, they were sort of gathering the funds and making it possible financially for other parts to contribute. So they were central in that. Interestingly enough, they were central. The Rabanel family was also a cornerstone of the financing of the Columbus expedition that came to America, to discover America, apparently, in 1492 when they left. That's the first, because he was trying to prevent the expulsion of Jews from Spain, so they financed basically everything. The next trips of Columbus, the second and third trip of Columbus to America, were financed with money that was stolen from the Jews when they were expelled. I mean, that's very clear. It's historical evidence, very abundant on that. Be it as it may. So here we have a problem because the Portuguese king has to get rid of the Jews, and yet we need financial support. But it's not just financial, it's know-how. The major physician of the court was a Jew. The major advisor of the court was a Jew, Joseph Vizino. The major astronomer of the country at this particular moment was Rabbi Abraham Zacuto. And look, we could be talking for hours just about the role of Rabbi Abraham Zacuto in the Portuguese exploits. It's enough to tell you that Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, who is the astronomer of the king at this stage. I have documents signed by the king paying him and him signing in Hebrew his name as the mathematician, as he calls the mathematician of the crown. And he has the charts, the maps, the technology of the astrolabe. The technology of the astrolabe made it possible navigation in the high seas as opposed to navigation by the coast where you can see where you are. When you are in the high seas, you have to go by the stars. And he developed the technology, the astrolabe, that allowed the Portuguese and then all the other navigators to do that. Now, I'll tell you something so that you don't think that I'm exaggerating. Rabbi Abraham Zacuto, his work to make possible all these discoveries is important enough. His scientific work is important enough for him to be named in the 1930s. One of the craters in the moon was named after him. There is a crater in the moon that was named by the NASA and other, the Zacut crater. That's how important his work was. Okay? So again, this is no exaggeration at all on what I'm saying. So how can the Portuguese deal with this then? How can you get rid of the Jews, but you need them? So you basically, you solve the problem, so to speak, in a very smart but dramatic way, which is you basically keep your Jews by forcing them to convert, by converting them by force, which immediately means that, yes, there is a decree of expulsion of Portugal. Nobody was expelled. Literally, there were maybe 8, 10 people that were able to leave, literally, because the objective was systematically enforce acts of conversion, aggressive and communal conversion, and with other types of legislation that was introduced. So you have the decree of expulsion. There is a decree of expulsion of 1496, which of course satisfies the conditions of the marriage for Spain. But then that is followed by 3 major episodes of forced conversions. In the Hanukkah of 1496, children were massively converted, taken away from the parents and converted, in many cases sent to some islands in the Atlantic that had been discovered by the Portuguese and were literally thrown to the crocodiles. There is a lot of rabbinic and writings talking about that. Passover of 1497, again, forcibly kidnapping and conversion of children. And finally, in October of 1497, right after the high holidays, you have a massive, about 20, 30,000 people that are promised ships to leave the country in Lisbon, in downtown Lisbon, and they were there for several days. They were deprived of water, deprived of food, deprived of everything, and then they were just sprinkled water upon and baptized by force. It's so-called, they were baptized while standing up. That's the expression that was used at the time. Batizados em pé, the ones that were baptized when they were standing up. Now, we have to keep in mind that the objective, and this is critical to understand how it was possible for things to remain so long under cover, because the objective was to keep the Jewish population so that they could in some way continue helping financially, intellectually, and all the other things. The decree of expulsion and the massive conversions were followed or were put together with 2 other pieces of policy or legislation that were fundamental. The first was those people that were converted by force, those thousands and thousands and thousands, they were forbidden to leave the country. They were forbidden to leave the country. Because you can see, if you're forcing somebody and you give the people the opportunity to escape the country, they will. But they were forbidden. You can think about North Korea. What happens to somebody if a relative escapes? Okay, so they were forbidden to leave the country. And of course, that fulfills the idea that they need to stay and do their thing. At the same time, you also understand, or the monarch and the politicians of the time also understand that these new Christians, that these people that were the cream of the crop of Jewry, that were being converted by force, they didn't know the first thing about Christianity. So they were given a period that we would now call a don't ask, don't tell period, where they were sort of allowed to learn slowly, and where the lapses were understood. So basically, they were given 20 years, and this 20 years was repeated then and prolonged a few times to sort of adapt to the new religion. This is very important. These three things explain why in Portugal, more than anywhere else in the world, these heathen Judaism survived for so long. Because we are talking about people that were not expelled, really. We are talking about people that were the cream of the crop and were converted by force. Not only they were converted by force, but they were forced to stay in the country. And not only they were converted by force and forced to stay, but they were given a grace period. And what do you think that they did in that grace period? They adjusted. They had 20, 30, 40 years to adjust Judaism to underground. And that's what they did. Of course, they ended up with a form of Judaism that we would not recognize, but you could transform things and follow things underground. Just to give you a sense of the things that we are talking about, we know the concept of Pesach Sheni, that is the idea, the biblical idea that if for whatever reason you cannot do Passover in the proper time, you have a second chance. It's wonderful. We always have second chances. And so you can do certain things to make up 1 month after. One of the things that these many people did was immediately start observing the holidays 1 month after, or whatever they could observe of the holidays, because they knew that the Christians were on top of them if Yom Kippur comes or this comes. So they just transferred. That was an immediate thing. Transfer everything 1 month. And there are many things like that. We'll come back to those adaptations as we continue. So again, Jews were not expelled from Portugal. The Spanish and Portuguese Jews were not expelled. They were forced to convert. They were forced to stay in the country, and they were given a don't ask, don't tell period to adjust themselves, which they used to develop an underground system. Now, very briefly, I want to tell you that this is, of course, the beginning also of the Sephardic diaspora, because although they were not allowed to leave the country, we know that even now there is only so much you can do in terms of preventing people from leaving or entering the country. So there was a major inflow, a major outflow. There was an absolutely major outflow, first to Italy, to the Ottoman Empire, and then much later, about 100 years or so after, then Holland became the safe haven. And ultimately, when you get to the 1600s, you have already these communities going to South America, Brazil, for example, and then eventually coming to the United States. It's a fascinating story. It's one of my talks is actually to relate all of these to the beginning of a Jewish settlement in what is the United States. Those were 23 Portuguese Jews that were refugees from Brazil. Brazil was a Portuguese colony at the time, was under Dutch supervision, Dutch governance. They was occupied by the Dutch, and when the Portuguese reconquered Brazil, the Jewish refugees were expelled again, and they had to run away, and they basically left and went to the closest Dutch colony, which was New Amsterdam. So in 1634, you have the first, 1653, you have the first inflow of the Jews in the United States to settle in New Amsterdam, and those again, 23 Portuguese Jews. So the point here is that the story of the Portuguese diaspora and Spanish diaspora, Jewish diaspora, is incredible, and the stories are fabulous. And if you have a chance of ever looking at this connection with the beginning of Jewish settlement in the United States, or if you look at the great history of Dona Gracia Nasi, the Giveret, the La Senora, uh, a great, an incredible entrepreneur lady from the 1500s that did, again, an absolutely mind-boggling amount of work in favor of the Jewish community all over Europe. Anyway, so that's the diaspora. Now, what we really want to focus a little bit more is the Jewish survival in Portugal proper. Okay, so 1497, people were converted by force, and they are stuck. All the Jewish books were confiscated. All the synagogues were transformed either in stables or prisons. And Jewish, anything that was communal property or was religious property was confiscated, and that was the end of it. So the actual end of everything, more formally, when all the illusions disappeared, was with the Lisbon pogrom on April of 1506. This was Passover, and predictably enough, Jews by this time still didn't quite know what to do. It was Easter as well, and well, there was a lot of confusion. Be it as it may, about 6,000 Jews were slaughtered in Lisbon at that time. And again, that was pretty much the end of any illusions that things would go smoothly. There is an enormous amount of legislation over the next 100 years or so, 150 years, that the legislation tells us about how strong this new Christian community was and all the problems. So, for example, this legislation of the don't ask, don't tell was renewed several times. There was legislation that was being repeated several times forbidding the new Christians, these Jews, from leaving Portugal, which means that was becoming a lot of a problem. There was also legislation that was sort of suspending the confiscation of property, which means, of course, that was legislation before confiscating the property of families that would live and so forth. So again, the constant legislation for the next couple of 100 years really testifies to how much and how strong this presence was and how difficult it was to absorb, obviously. The Inquisition itself in Portugal was established in 1536. And the Portuguese Inquisition, we don't need to talk too much about it, aside from the fact that it really was another, so to speak, nail in the coffin of the Portuguese Jewry, because then everybody was in a position of denouncing or being denounced by everybody else. So everybody who could leave the country around the time of the beginning of the Inquisition, they left. There was a major outflow of refugees at that time. Again, a fascinating story in and of itself. And the Inquisition continued in all its glory, not just in Portugal, but in the colonies, in the Portuguese colonies, Brazil and Africa and so forth. And it so happens that this year marks, actually, 2021, marks the 200 years of the official disbanding of the Inquisition. So the Inquisition was officially disbanded in 1821. Okay, so we have development of a large-scale crypto-Judaism, heathen Judaism, throughout this period of a couple of 100 years. It's an extensive legislation that betrays that. It's the extensive diaspora that betrays that. Constant people leaving from Portugal and going to other places and coming back to Judaism. But we know also, not only from the people that remained, but also those who managed to leave, that these were people, look at it this way, one generation after, so if you're talking even in the middle 1500s, these were people that already were born into new Christian families, into forcibly converted families. If you give another generation, how much do they know already? So, for example, Jewish names disappeared immediately. I mean, having a Jewish name was a Hebrew name was given away. I mean, that was one of the tricks of the Inquisition, arresting kids and then asking, "What is your name?" and say, "Oh, my name is John." And you say, "No, no, no, the name that your parents call you, Jonathan." "Oh, okay, gotcha." So, I mean, giving names, Jewish names disappeared almost immediately. Circumcision, again, a very open show of Jewishness, which was anathema in the Catholic countries until very recently, until a few decades ago, disappeared. The public observance of Shabbat and holidays disappeared completely. You had some underground celebrations still. The dietary laws disappeared, observance disappeared, obviously, as well. Mostly, the best that it could be done was to avoid certain things and to develop some products that looked, for example, like pork products, but in fact were not pork, were turkey. That's a very famous Jewish, so to speak, Jewish sausage that is developed in a certain area of Portugal to this day. That is actually looks like a normal Portuguese sausage that is made of pork, but it's made of turkey. So at least you would do that to avoid having pork. So there are a few idiosyncrasies of this type, and of course, all the social and cultural network disappeared. All the charitable institutions, all the learning institutions, everything disappeared. And we have to understand also that whatever was kept was progressively kept in a very distorted way. I mean, again, just imagine what it is having a very strong sense of being Jewish, but not really knowing what that means because you don't have any books. The only thing that you have to sort of orient yourself is the Hebrew part of the Christian Bibles. It's the Old Testament. That's pretty much what you have. You don't have any Jewish books. They were all stolen. We know we have documentation showing that all the books were stolen and put, all Sephorim were put in a major synagogue in Lisbon that then was completely locked. And you have thousands of volumes there that ended up being sold throughout Europe. So people didn't know. And that in and of itself ended up creating some problems because having this very strong Jewish identity, but then you don't have any connection with the major Jewish texts, but only with the Hebrew Bible in itself, which means that there were lots of things in terms of Jewish observance of Shabbat and holidays and kosher and so forth, that you really do not have the blessing of the understandings that the Mishnah and the Talmud and all the commentaries give us. So this is basically where things work. Now, when we get to this point, it's important to also understand, although I hope it's sort of clear, why we are focusing so much on the Portuguese case. Because, again, the Portuguese case is really the Portuguese and Spanish. That's where Iberian Jews were. It's Portuguese case by circumstance, by geography, but this is really the Iberian, the last survival of the Iberian underground Judaism, if you want. Now, if you fast forward a little bit, if we get by the middle of the 1700s, there is a growing sense that the Jewish problem had been solved or was about to be solved. So in the middle 1700s, there was some legislation that actually forced conversions between marriages between the new Christians and the old Christians, meaning the Jews that were forced to convert and the old Christian families. This is part of an idea of bringing together the merchant classes and the nobility. The new Christians, the Jews, were mostly merchants. The Christians were most nobility. And this was a time, was not just in Portugal, was throughout Europe, where nobles did not have money, but have titles, nobility titles, and merchants did not have titles but had money. So there was a lot of pressure for these families to get together. And in the case of Portugal, that represented by and large, sort of mixing, forced mixing of the old Christian and the new Christian families. After the 1700s, you basically don't have any more visible exodus of Jews from Portugal, not in any meaningful number. Eventually, by 1773, the distinction between new Christians and old Christians was abolished. By 1774 was the first attempt to abolish the Inquisition on grounds that it was not needed anymore. So essentially, there was this idea that starting in the middle 1700s, but if you go all the way to the late 1800s, the issue had been solved. So there were no more Jews in Portugal. I mean, the Jews had been absorbed. There was no more Judaism. Portugal had finally been rid or cleansed of its Jews. There are several publications that are from that time that I think are absolutely fascinating. There is this publication, The History of the Jews in Portugal, that was published in Germany by Rabbi Meir Kaiserling, a great historian, in 1867. And he says clearly that there are no more Jews in Portugal at that time. It's gone. There is a monumental history of the new Christians, the Portuguese new Christians, that was written by a Portuguese historian in 1921. And it states that the dream of Isabella and of Manuel I of Portugal had been fulfilled. As of the start of the 1800s, Judaism had been eradicated from the Iberian Peninsula. And the great historian Cecil Roth, in 1931, he writes The History of the Marranos. And in 1931, my friends, he has to write an epilogue, a post note to the book, because throughout the book, he basically says that there are no more Jews in Portugal. And then something happened, and he had at last minute, he had to add something at the end, saying that, whoops, I was not right. After all, this was an optical illusion. They are still there. Despite the fact that the common wisdom was that the Jews had been eradicated, Judaism had been eradicated from Portugal, at the same time, you have a very strong awareness that have all these incidental pieces and bits of evidence that suggest that maybe it's not what it used to be. Of course, it's been diluted, but has not been completely eradicated. There is something going on there. So in 1791, for example, we have an account of a family that runs away from Portugal, refugees from Portugal, and in Bordeaux, that is in the one of the first major cities in France with a Jewish presence. They actually got there, and the first thing that the father of the family did, according to the records of the Bordeaux congregation, was to circumcise the whole family, including himself. Things didn't work very well, as you probably can imagine. But again, it's a story that is in the records of the synagogue in Sephardic synagogue in Bordeaux. In 1807, the French Napoleonic forces invade Portugal. The chronicles of the invasion, the French chronicles of the invasion, have several episodes of the Spanish troops finding Jews in Portugal. There is a very moving episode of a French soldier that was captured by the Portuguese forces, and he was about to be executed. And according to the chronicles of the Napoleonic invasions, it says that when he was about to be executed, he recited the Shema. And when he recited the Shema, being Jewish as he was, several of the people that were about to execute him said, no, we just run away, just go, you are one of us, we are all Jews, we don't want to kill. And a couple of other stories of that nature. In 1819, there is a new synagogue that is being dedicated in Lisbon. This is a synagogue with implants. These are not Portuguese origin Jews. These are people that come from North Africa and business people that are invited. It's a different story in and of itself. But there is a synagogue that is dedicated at that time, and you have people coming from out of the woods claiming to be Jewish to go there and see the dedication of the new synagogue. And finally, just in this line of things, in 1885, there is a clear official record of the Portuguese consul in France that requests a Jewish burial. So there are echoes all over the place that suggests that maybe the Judaism was not eradicated. And this leads us directly now to the last act of this saga, and that is the first Marrano revival of the 1920s. In the 1920s, or before that, in 1917, a Polish mining engineer, he has some business dealings in Portugal. His name is Shlomo Schwartz. And he's in the north of the country, in the area around Belmont, in those general areas. And at some point, he's trying to get in business with some locals. Of course, as a mining engineer, there are lots of mines in that area. And he's trying to get in business, and he narrows it down basically to two competitors. And one of the competitors tells him that, look, I have a foolproof way of convincing you to go into business with me and not with the other guy, because the other guys are Jewish. And Shlomo Schwartz is thinking to himself, okay, I'm obviously going to do business with the other guys if they are Jewish, but that's weird because I didn't realize that there were Jewish people here. So this was the beginning of Shlomo Schwartz becoming much more than a Polish mining engineer, but becoming someone that dedicated a fair amount of his time and effort to actually try to figure out what was going on. He was eventually invited to, after a lot of effort, he was eventually invited to join one of the heathen groups. And incidentally, he eventually writes, it's more a documentation. It's not exactly a book, but it's a record of all his efforts and everything. So it's something that he wrote very early in the process, and it's very difficult to find. That's this book that you have right here on your right-hand side. So it's named The New Christians in Portugal in the 20th Century. So, and he's invited, and the story of this first meeting that it tells us is a very interesting story, because he goes to what presumably was a Shabbat service. He doesn't recognize anything. Everything is rather strange for him. Not only, first of all, he didn't recognize any of the prayers or anything. Furthermore, he was rather surprised because all the services and everything that was of any ritual meaning was done by women. Women literally were the ones that did from heathen funerals, or I mean, the funeral services, to the marriages, to the namings, to everything, and the services were done by women. And there is a reason for that. That's Judaism was hidden in the home. Whatever was left of Judaism was not outside, was hidden in the home. And so women became the standard bearers of the tradition. They were the ones that memorized the services and so forth. So, but the whole thing was very strange, okay? And he was put to a test. And basically what he says is that, look, they told me, you claim to be Jewish. You, Shlomo Schwartz, you claim to be Jewish, okay? That's funny, because we didn't know that there were Jews in Poland, but okay. Now, if you're Jewish, prove to us that you're Jewish. And Shlomo Schwartz, he writes that he recited the Shema, and I'll recite the Shema as it is. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. So he said the word Adonai. And when he said the word Adonai, people freaked out, because they said, okay, you're Jewish, because only a Jew would know that word, But that is the name of God that we don't pronounce. We don't say that name. Of course, that's not true in mainstream Judaism as we understand it today. We say that word instead of Yud Kei Vav Kei. But the tradition that had developed when the Hebrew was lost and the four-letter name of God was forgotten and all that type of things was that Adonai is the word that you don't say. It's the name of God you don't pronounce. So, yes, you may be Jewish, but you're not so good. Of course, things were cleared, and he ended up finding a very interesting form of Judaism. A very interesting form of Judaism where things have a Jewish resemblance, obviously, but were very different in many different aspects. So, of course, you have all the observance of the holidays that could be done in secret a month later, if that was the case. Most of the joyous holidays disappeared, so there was very little recollection, for example, of Hanukkah or Purim. And that is understandable because people didn't associate Judaism with something that was very happy. So that's not. On the other hand, for example, the central role of Moses have been replaced by Queen Esther. Queen Esther was really the idol of these communities. This is a small community. It was the idol because Queen Esther, of course, is someone that survives against all odds. Is someone that saves the Jewish people, someone that was a redeemer of sorts. So it was a very important role model. And because of that, this community that didn't know anything about Purim was one of the last holdouts to fast 3 days before what is Purim, because that's what Queen Esther did. So it's a very interesting way of dealing with things and priorities. Now, the fact that these communities, and these are different communities, were discovered, this was like wildfire in Europe at the time. The Jewish community in London, in particular, took an interest, and they created a committee to help the Portuguese Jews. That committee was very active from 1926, basically until 1939. And of course, we know 1939 was a very difficult year. So we have in the Jewish Daily Bulletin the information about the creation of this committee to help the Marranos return to Judaism. Again, persistently, you have these reports. Lucien Wolf was sent as a shaliach there to investigate everything. Again, it was something that captured completely the imagination of world Jewry in the 1920s. The discovery of these lost brethren that were very strongly Jewish, although, I mean, not maybe exactly the way we understand it, but clearly they were able to keep at least an ethnic Jewish identity and lots of observances that were obviously Jewish in nature. So it's not normative Judaism as we understand it, but it's clearly holdouts from centuries of heathen Judaism. And so at that time, there was again a very big effort to bring people back to Judaism. And just to give you a sense of things, at that time, we are talking about 10,000 people. So it's a very sizable number of people in these different communities, mostly in the north of the country, because that's the north of the country, that's the mountainous areas. And so you have a very large number of people. Again, 10,000 is a very sizable number. And the work on the ground was led by someone that is called the Apostle of the Marranos. This is a captain, Barros Bastos, of his name, Israel Ben Rosh. He was someone was from those communities, but having lived in the big cities. He was educated, he was in the military, he was actually a great hero, one of the Portuguese great heroes of World War I. He was a decorated hero. He was very famous in general in the country. He was one of the people that announced the creation, the foundation of the Portuguese Republic in October of 1910. He's the one in Oporto, in the second city, who actually proclaimed the Republic, which was a very, very, very big thing. He was the founder of the Portuguese Boy Scouts. This is a guy that was very famous in its own right for many other things. But after around this time, he dedicated his life literally to the work of redemption, what he called the work of redemption. A obra de resgate, as it's called in Portuguese, the work of redemption. And basically what he did was literally go through several steps that ensured that the revival of these communities would be effective and people would have the opportunity of coming back to mainstream Judaism. So he was the leader of what was mostly a 10,000 people endeavor. He himself made his return to Judaism, as it is called, as it is referred to, as we refer to it. He made his tshuva, he made his return to Judaism with the Sephardic rabbinate, which at the time was in Morocco. He founded the Yeshiva Rosh Pinah, in the Jewish Theological Seminary in Porto. Yeshiva Rosh Pinah, the Rosh Pinah, that's the cornerstone, meaning the first stone of a building, because that's the idea, is building something. He created that yeshiva. He started a newspaper, a Jewish newspaper, that he published basically until 1958, when he was already getting very old and not being very able to do things. And the thing that is interesting, it's fascinating because it tells you a lot about the times. The name of the newspaper that he created in 1927 is Alapid. Alapid means the torch, but it means more than the torch. So, for example, in the Latin languages, Alapid could easily be translated as the fascia. So Alapid could be understood as the term that is in the origin of the word fascism, the fascio. So it's a sign of times. Of course, fascism at this time didn't mean anything, but it's a name that probably would not have been chosen 5 years later. Alapid, be it as it may, and actually even the translation in Portuguese is the fascio, el fascio. It's like a bundle of things. Okay, so in addition to that, he wrote an enormous number of booklets explaining not only the services of Yom Kippur, explaining the Haggadah of Passover, explaining the Shabbat services and so forth, about Jewish history, you name it. I mean, he has a very large number of these books. These are small books that he published, pamphlets really, and most of these pamphlets, incidentally, were printed and financed by the Shearit Israel congregation in New York, Sephardic, the Portuguese and Spanish, and the Solopol Foundation. The Solopol Foundation, again, Solopol, the rabbinic family, Solopol is a very famous Sephardic family from the Shearit Israel synagogue, and it's the Solopol Foundation that financed a lot of these books being printed. The Haggadah Shel Pesach is actually an interesting exception because it was actually printed in Austria at that time, and although it's a Haggadah, it's in Hebrew with Ladino translation, then everything else that is descriptions of the local where it was produced and everything else is in Yiddish. So it's a very interesting case. Another thing that he was able to do And notice we already talked about creating creating a yeshiva, creating a newspaper, creating all these literary outputs, all this production. He was instrumental in the construction of and in making it possible the dedication of the Beit Kaduri synagogue. So there is a synagogue, the Mekor Chaim, the source of life, the construction was started in 1929, and it was dedicated 9 years after in 1938. And this was a monumental effort that he engaged upon, and this is something that it's a beautiful building. This is actually what the building, this picture here is what the building looks like now. This building of this synagogue, unfortunately, look, it was dedicated in 1938. 1938, it's very close to the beginning of World War II. The Nazis are in power, it's very strong and everything. In Portugal, you had already a fascist regime in the country, so things were not going well at all. More on that in a second. And so the synagogue really, after the dedication, after the day of the dedication, basically never operated. And to make sure that it would never operate again, the Portuguese authorities, the fascist authorities, actually offered the building next to it to the German embassy, to the Nazi embassy, and the building next to it was the German school in Portugal, the Nazi school in Portugal. So it was a way of making sure that the building would never be used. Parenthetically, this building was never used regularly until about 10 years ago. And about the last 10 years, there is a revival of the Jewish community in Porto. Some of the descendants of these people that we are talking about, other expatriates from English-speaking countries, be it as it may, it has been a wonderful revival. They have a rabbi there. They have everything. I mean, it's beautiful to see how for the first time, this actually operating in the last 10 years. So we are still seeing the work of Capitan Barros Bastos being fruitful all this time later. And it's an absolutely beautiful building. The last time I went to this synagogue, it was before the last 10 years, before all of these. And the custodian was a Christian guy who was doing a nice job upkeeping things. But I went to see the mikveh, see how it was. And the mikveh was filled with Christmas trees. So that gives you an idea of how abandoned things were 20 years ago. Anyway, so this is a beautiful synagogue that he was instrumental, and he engaged extensively in this work of redemption, going all over the north areas of the country and bringing people back to Yiddishkeit. It was absolutely incredible. And so you have all types of different areas, different groups sprouting out. And next, it's like wildfire, and you have 10,000 crypto Jews coming out of the closet and learning about mainstream Judaism and embracing or trying to embrace mainstream Judaism and so forth. And it was a very exciting time for everybody. It was a very exciting time for the international community. And you can see still all the different communities that now appear in the northern areas of Portugal. There is a little bit of a spillover for Spain, but not too much. Unfortunately, this is probably one of the most horrible examples of bad timing, because this is happening when the Portuguese government becomes a fascist government. The fascists take over in 1932. Spain, fascism takes over in 1936 with the civil war in Spain in 1936. From 1922, Italy was a fascist country. In 1933, of course, it's the beginning of the Nazi dominance in Germany, which means that, again, this is a horrible timing, absolutely horrible timing. And the way that translated itself is by the time, as I mentioned to you, by the time the synagogue was dedicated in 1938, most of this revival was already going back to the closet. People came out of the closet and they were going back to the closet really fast. And Captain Byros Bastos, he went from being the apostle to the Marranos to being dubbed now by many the Portuguese Dreyfus, because he ended up being arrested. Of course, the main reason was that he was promoting Judaism among people that were officially Christians. And so, while it was tolerated to have Jews that came from other countries, that were Jews from birth and so forth, but these people that were officially Christians, the fact that you were taking them from an officially Christian situation to something that is now practicing Judaism, it was an abomination for the regime. So he ended up being expelled from the military. He was, as a matter of fact, he was condemned and expelled disgracefully on grounds of being homosexual. The justification was that he was homosexual because he was promoting circumcision among people. Don't ask me what is the connection, because I don't know what is the connection, but that's the way it was phrased. So again, things went really bad very fast, which of course leads us to the third, to the final act of all of this, which is the second Marrano revival in the 1980s. So people went back to the closet. Those 10,000 people disappeared out of circulation as fast as they could. They got out of the closet, they got hit on their heads really fast, and they went back to the closet. It's enough to tell you that the Portuguese regime was very close to the fascist regime in Italy. It was very close to the fascist regime in Spain, was very close to the Nazi regime in Germany, and that didn't bode well for the Portuguese communities at all. The Portuguese Jewish community, the mainstream community, interestingly enough, was less affected, but those communities that were perceived as horrible Christians, because they were officially Christians that had abandoned Christianity, and while for us was going back to the origins, for them was betraying the Christian faith, that was pretty nasty. And to a point that the Nazis actually offered a couple of gas chambers to be installed in the northern areas of the country. They were installed, they were never used, thank God, but they were there, and they were enough of deterrence. So people just went back to the closet, to the proverbial closet. The second Marrano revival comes in the 1980s, and we are no longer talking about 10,000 people. We are no longer talking about 200,000 people as in the late 1400s. We are talking about a couple of hundred people now in the city of Belmont, in the town of Belmont. But this is the last holdout. This is the last holdout. This is when in the 1980s, there is a growing concern and a growing awareness that now that the country is a democracy, now that there is freedom of religion, maybe it's enough to stop. It's time to stop pretending again. And so this is a time in which, through my connections and others, I started with other people going there in 1986, 1987. This is actually in the middle. The picture in the middle is a Mizrach. This is a Western Wall decoration that I took at the time, and this is what was our table where we did the prayers. And this is some group of us. Incidentally, this guy here is me in 1987. That is me right there at 1987. And a lot of these people now are very prominent in the Jewish community and in the country. I mean, we were, of course, much younger then. But at this stage, of course, the main concern of people in Belmont at the time was that after the truth of the matter is that the old ways did not appeal to the new generation. This is a new generation that has access to information and everything. So they wanted to connect to other Jewish communities. They want to connect to Israel. Not only that, but these families had been marrying and intermarrying among them for generations. in this small city of Belmont, most of the people, most of the Jews there had genetic diseases because of that. They could not see at night, for example. People could not see at night. It's genetic diseases, and if you look at them, I'm going to say that sounds gross, but they all look a little bit the same because again, it's families with families. So the young generation, they really need to connect to the outside world, and at the same time, the older generation were getting to a point that say, look, we are sick and tired of pretending something. When we die, at least when we die, we want to be buried as Jews. So you have the young generation saying, I want to reach out to the outside world, and I want to get married to somebody that's not from here. And the old generation saying, when I die, I want to be buried as a Jew. So that was basically and again, being in a democracy, this was something that was possible to work on. These here are pictures from that time. This is actually a hidden celebration of Passover. It's interesting that they were wearing a kittel. This is not an old tradition, the wearing in white and the big robes. This is something that was introduced in this community in the 1920s, in the first revival, by an Ashkenazic rabbi that was there and was helping the country for a while. I mean, this is not an ancient custom, but be it as it may, it's a Passover celebration. And in 1989 was a turning point for the community. In 1989, I was blessed with being appointed by the community. This is actually a very interesting story because I tried very hard to help them because my family comes from areas that are close to this community, and I reached out actually at that point at 1988, 87. We reached out to Lubavitcher Rabbi to ask for help, and basically the Lubavitcher Rabbi told us that you should help informally, and when people come back to the fold officially, we will help then in another way. That was what the Rabbi decided, and so basically I reached out to Rabbi Ovadia Yosef. And to the chief rabbi at the time, that was Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. And I had the opportunity in the winter of 1989 to go to Israel, representing the community, trying to get support in the rabbinate and so forth. And there was a lot of support from some, not only the rabbinate, but the Sochnut, the Jewish agency, and the Mizrach Lada, that is a philanthropic organization that was led by Reuven Kashani at that time. And that is actually me on the top, meeting with Yosef Begun, a Soviet refusenik, which was somebody that me and my group in the States, we were doing a lot to free him. So he was freed, and I had was blessed with the opportunity of seeing him. And this is actually a report from the Jerusalem Post on the 24th of November of 1989, talking about my visit and talking about all the connections and things that we were doing to help the Jewish community.
Rabbi,
one of the most moving moments was
Rabbi?
when the question.
I'm interrupting you for a moment. I have a bunch of questions coming in, so I just want to know what our time frame is before.
Okay, I have maybe 5 minutes.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. So the most moving moment of that trip to Israel to support and gather support and religious and otherwise to the Jewish community in Belmont was a meeting with Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu. And incidentally, it should be said that one of the people that helped enormously to facilitate all of these was Rabbi Meir Kahane. Rabbi Meir Kahane, of course, we know how controversial he was. And so from the get-go, he says, I'll put you guys in touch with everybody, but I'm out of the picture because I don't want to contaminate anything with anything. So, but he was in the background. He's the one that made it possible, the meeting with Rabbi Yosef, and so forth. So, be it as it may, we got a meeting with Rabbi Mordechai Eliyahu, who was the chief Sephardic rabbi, and I told him from that my people in Belmont, our people, that we wanted to give him a message. And that is that when we hold the fringes of our talit, when we hold the fringes, we know the four fringes, they represent, of course, the Jewish people in the four corners of the world. But we feel, if you look at these, of all these fringes, that is this picture in the middle, there is a fringe here that is left out. We feel that we are like this fringe. All the Jewish people is there, and we are here. And we want to be back next to that fringe. And we want their help to go back next to the fringe. So the follow-up of this was indeed the rabbinate in Israel. They sent Shaliach, Rabbi Yosef Sebag, originally from Morocco. Sebag actually is the name of the Moroccan families that came from the Iberian Peninsula, whose name was Pinto. And the Pinto is the Moroccan for, Sebag is the Moroccan for Pinto. And it's part of my family's Pinto family as well. And so they were there, the Jewish community was created, and eventually in 1496, in the 50th anniversary of 1496, the synagogue was dedicated. The Beit Eliyahu synagogue was dedicated. And throughout this process, this was an absolutely incredible experience. It was an absolutely incredible return to Yiddishkeit. And in fact, when my Lubavitch fellows would say in this time that you go to Crown Heights to recharge my batteries, I say, I go to Belmont to recharge my batteries. I mean, that's, of course, no way downgrading the importance of Crown Heights, but I go to Belmont to recharge my batteries. That's how energized things were. Around this time, there were 30 people in one go that were circumcised. There was a mohel from France that came to do things. So it's a fascinating series of events. But the important thing is that, okay, if you were to go there today, you would see a community that is completely ordinary. You have a synagogue, have a mikveh, have a hotel, you have a bookstore, you have some kosher stores. Normal, perfectly normal, completely ordinary, and yet truly extraordinary. How, after 500 years, you have a bunch of families that are not remotely related. They are historically the direct descendants of the people that generation through generation on the ground have been keeping some type of Judaism alive. There is nothing ordinary about what you would see. It would be truly extraordinary. So what does this all mean to me and mean to us? Look, this is a story of survival against all odds. It's a beautiful story of survival. It's a beautiful story of how the ordinary and what is normal can really be truly extraordinary. But what does it mean for us? What does it mean for us? Look, for me and for us, what I think it means is, and it's the lesson that I got from these people, I looked at them and I saw how easy it would have been for them to say, whatever, I've been suffering all my life. My parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents. Enough already. Why should we care about this Jewish thing? It would be so easy for them to do that. And yet they didn't. And yet they persisted in not doing it. And they persisted in reconnecting. And if you look at these people, that you're not just looking at them, you're looking at all these generations that were able to sacrifice so much to keep something Jewish going on. And I ask myself, how much would I sacrifice for my Judaism? Would I be able to sacrifice as much as them? I don't know. Thank God we are not going to be put in that position. But it's food for thought, because here we are people that could have given up easily and didn't, and sacrificed a lot to be able to reconnect to their people, to their faith, to their everything. And yet, on the other hand, I look at people in this lovely, wonderful, free country of ours that truly behave as heathen Jews. I mean, when we have an opportunity of being all that we can be, and then we actually use the opportunity to do nothing, and I don't mean to be judgmental, I'm just being descriptive. We live in a wonderful country. It's a wonderful opportunity. We can do everything like in no other time in the history of Jewry, really. And yet, how many of us are hidden Jews, really? So for me, that's the lesson, is looking at these people and be inspired by their persistence, by their effort throughout the generations to remain Jewish in their own way, even if that's what it was, to keep their Judaism. And use that as an inspiration for us to use all the opportunities that we can, to express our Judaism freely in this wonderful country of ours, where we can do it freely. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, Rabbi, Doctor. That was an incredible, well, I'm a history buff. I like history, and I like people that share history, and that was incredible. I think your message, especially with what's going on in the world today,
Yeah.
where there's this whole question now, do Jews have to hide their yarmulke? Should we hide being Jewish?
Yep.
And the Montana answer we decided Friday night at our Shabbos table was, wear a yarmulke and carry a loaded gun, and you're safe.
Yeah.
But I really, really appreciate, especially knowing that it's 3:30 in the morning for you now. But there are a couple of questions that came in.
Sure.
Some of them you may have touched on. So when you said
Please.
earlier, they didn't say the name Adonai. So what name were they using instead of the name Adonai in their prayers?
Well, the thing is that all the prayers incidentally were in Portuguese, not in Hebrew, where everything was in Portuguese. And so you have only one leftover. Well, there were a couple of leftover words from Hebrew that had been sort of modified throughout time, and then there was the word Adonai that they would not read. They would call just the Lord or something in Portuguese. So by the same token that when we see the Yud Kei Vav Kei, we don't read that. We read something else, right?
They would see it but not pronounce it because it was.
That's correct. Because for them, that was the name. That was the name original name of God that we don't pronounce. That was their recollection.
One of the things you said that blew me away, and I turned to my daughter who was sitting next to me, and we both smiled because it was something really powerful. You said that they moved their Jewish hero. They moved over from Moses to Esther.
Yes.
Which, by the way, I could think of worse things. Esther's in our book, Esther's a pretty good one. My question is there any correlation between the fact that they made Esther into their heroine or their leader or to their prophetess who they looked up to, and the fact that there are so many Catholics in the Catholic world, in the Hispanic countries, the name Esther is very, very common. I'm wondering if there's a correlation between that.
Well, I think the correlation runs in a different way. The sense that I have is that from the history of Purim, what you see is someone who is in a very hostile environment, who persists in her Jewishness and succeeds. So it's this part of being hidden, because that's the connotation of Esther. It's hidden, and against all odds, she survived, and she saved the Jewish people. So it's this aspect of success, being hidden and having the people in distress and the people in the brink of extermination, and the story ends up really well.
Right.
That's what is captivating. Incidentally, historically, if you go back through the centuries, there were a lot of overtones in terms of these bad stories that end well, and a lot of it was sort of transferred into heightened messianic hopes. Uh, the Jewish refugees, the Marranos, the Portuguese Anusim, had a very fair number of false messiahs, which again is part of this idea of very well. I mean, you need salvation in some way. You need something to
You need
happen.
hope. You need to cling to hope, and therefore they cling to
Yes,
whatever
yes,
comes
yes, yes.
their way.
And as a matter of fact, there are it reverberates enormously all the way to the apostasy of Shabbatai Zvi, even that late, but
Right.
much earlier with Solomon Molcho and David Rubeini. So there were, yeah.
So I guess in the same in part of that discussion about how they never they always saw survival. You mentioned the genetic diseases or
Yeah.
disorders that they had. So is it safe to say that the Marrano Jews only married within the Marrano community?
So that is something that it depends a lot on the specific areas that you're talking about. So uh, let's put things in perspective. If the Jewish population in Portugal was about 20%, even with all the refugees, all the people that managed throughout the centuries to leave, this means that statistically speaking, a lot of the Portuguese population has Jewish connections one way or another. It's a statistical fact that means nothing. But this put things in perspective in the sense that we have a very large number of people that have some type of Jewish connection. But when you get all the way to the 1920s, the people that are left over in some way from all of these are about 10,000. The people that are left over from all of these in 1980s is a couple of hundred.
Right.
So that means that these are the groups that in some way manage to develop mechanisms of survival of some identity. For example, this Jewish community in Belmont specifically, they have, as far as I remember, and as far as their memory goes, they had a very strong very strong rules to identify who was a Jew. So of course we go by matrilineal descent. For them, they would go by both matrilineal and patrilineal descent. You demanded both to be Jewish, otherwise you would not consider them Jewish,
Wow.
which of course is a humor. It's a way of making things much more difficult. So
Talking.
there were some mechanisms that were developed. For example, the idea also that most of the marriages were already almost arranged the moment a baby was born. The marriage was arranged already with a cousin or something like that. So, and this went on for generations.
Which
So
is
there were some mechanisms that allowed them to survive.
when you talked about that community, was it Belmont? You said.
Beaumont, yes,
Yeah. So
that's
just because we're in Montana, we want to know how jealous we should be of the community there. Do they have a kosher restaurant there too, or because on the list of things you said, I didn't hear restaurant.
uh, they have a hotel. They have a kosher store where they can buy food.
Okay, fine.
They
I'm not
don't
talking
really
about.
have a kosher restaurant. Uh, there is. It's a very interesting. It's a whole discussion, a whole different discussion. Uh, it's a whole different discussion how sometimes it's difficult for a community that developed their own mechanisms of survival, developed their own way of being Jewish and exercising their Judaism. Sometimes the transition into mainstream rabbinic Judaism is not easy.
Yeah,
And
for
this is
sure.
not something unique. It's something that we observe throughout the Sephardic diaspora. I mean, a major case in point is people like Baruch Espinoza or Uriel da Costa, or all these people that were great. These were people that sacrificed everything, leaving Portugal or Spain to be able to exercise their Judaism somewhere else. And when they go somewhere else, they end up being excommunicated because they cannot deal with it. I mean,
Well, we saw
their
that with,
view of Judaism is something different.
we saw that with a lot of the Ashkenazi Jews coming from Russia and Poland and Germany.
Yes, yes. As a matter of fact, in the historical writings, these people, they are referred to, these people that, like in the 1600s and 1700s, that leave Portugal, these new Christians that leave Portugal, go to Holland or go to the Ottoman Empire or Italy and try to come back to Judaism and have all types of problems, they are referred to as the new Jews, because they really, they have their separate communities. They really have a hard time dealing with lots of things. So there are some pockets of resistance of that in the older generations, but by and large, the younger generations, by younger I mean people that are 50 and younger, that qualifies as younger there, they have pretty much understood that the only way back to mainstream Judaism is accepting the rules of the game.
Very interesting. So Harvey Hamburg here is asking a question. He has a friend named Rich Elias, who's a Sephardic Jew, and he wants to know if Elias is a Sephardic name. The last
Elias?
name, Elias.
How do you spell it?
Elias, yeah.
Elias is the Portuguese for Eliyahu. Yes, Elias actually is the name. It's interesting. Is the name of the first president of the Jewish community there. Elias Nunes. In Hebrew is Eliyahu bin Nun. So I mean, his tradition is from the Nun family, biblical Nun family. So parenthetically, I should say that we have to understand that the Portuguese and Spanish communities, they not only they consider themselves the cream of the crop, but they were the cream of the crop, and they had a very high sense of nobility, and that sort of created a lot of problems when they started going back after a century, let's say, going back to the communities in other places, and their yichus, their lineage, as if it were, was not recognized.
Their elitism wasn't accepted in other communities.
Yes, I mean, for example, it was a big issue in Amsterdam. It's recorded in Amsterdam in the middle 1600s. There was a big controversy because there were all these families from Portuguese refugees that had in their tradition that they were Kohanim, they were a priestly class, and yet they were not able to act as priests, as the Kohanim, because they had to go through a return to Judaism that is a mild form of conversion, whatever it might have been, but their kahuna, was not being recognized. Now, you think that this is trivial, but keep in mind that in Sephardic congregations, it's like in Israel, you do the Birkat HaKohanim, the blessing of the Kohanim, every single service. So this is not a trivial issue. It's not like you do 4 times a year or 5 times a year, you know? So, yeah, you have a lot of controversy there.
I have, unless more questions come in on the chat, I have one last question, and if anyone
yes,
else,
please.
And that is, you mentioned the was Avram Zakuta and the you know, the crater named after him and all. And the question is, the question that was posed was, there's rumors and there's a lot of debate in American Jews, amongst American Jews, and even some secular and non-Jewish sources about whether Columbus was Jewish or not. Can you shed any light for us on whether Columbus himself had Jewish ancestry or not?
Well, I can give you, it's one of my lectures. I can give you a whole lecture about that. But no, but I give you the cliff notes. I'm not saying that I will not give the cliff, I will give the cliff notes. The cliff notes is that anyone that is honestly interested in analyzing things will know that there is no connection, no religious connection between Columbus and Jews. He had a lot of connections with Jews, but he was not Jewish. Not only was not Jewish, but there is no indication whatsoever that he was Jewish. For example, some of the great writings in the 1800s, just to give you an example, a lot of the information that we have about Christopher Columbus and the connection with the Jews. We have a book in the middle 1800s that is written by Rabbi Meyer Kaiserling, I mentioned before, one of the greatest historians of all the times, right? and he writes the history of Columbus and the Jews. It's a master work of information, and there is not the slightest reference to the idea that he may be Jewish. Quite the opposite. There is no reference whatsoever. Now that he has connections with Jews, big deal. But
Right.
no. I mean, some of the evidence that people say now is that because he left some money for the tzedakah of the people of one of the Gemach, one of the free loan associations in Lisbon. I mean, so and more importantly, not only there is no evidence whatsoever, the idea that he was Jewish was something that was invented literally by a Spanish writer who was a bitter anti-Semite, okay, in the early 1900s, and his writings, I mean, I cannot quote by heart the writings, but he bases his idea that Columbus was a Jew on the fact that Columbus was obstinate, was aggressive, was arrogant, and a few things like that. You see the style.
Got it.
So, I mean,
let's stay away from it. Okay, we're not taking credit for Columbus. Let's go.
No,
Anyone else? We had enough problems, Rabbi Pereira. We're not taking Columbus on our shoulders. We got enough.
No. Again, Columbus had a lot of connections with the Jews.
Sure.
And I'll tell you a story maybe to finish because it relates Columbus and Rabbi Zakutu, Avram Zakutu. You have 2 minutes to tell you the story, and
we're done with the questions. So we're done with the questions. So you'll wrap up with the story.
So I'll finish with this story.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, so I'll wrap up with this story. It's a fascinating story that is actually recorded in the accounts of the first expedition and the second expedition of Christopher Columbus. So it's a non-Jewish record of this event. We know that Christopher Columbus met with Rabbi Avram Zakutu several times to inspect the charts that Rabbi Zakutu produced, the Almanac Perpetuum, that's maritime charts, and not only maritime charts, but also charts about all the solar and lunar events. All of that is very important, again, to be able to navigate far away from land. So you have to just look at the stars and follow the stars. So, and we know, again, there's all type of documentation showing that Rabbi Zakutu taught him and explained and a lot of those stuff. And Christopher Columbus took these charts with him in the expeditions. Now, what happened in the second expedition to America is that he got stranded in an island that presumably is somewhere where Cuba or Jamaica or the Dominican Republic, we don't know exactly, but it's one of those islands in that area. He was stranded there for several weeks without food, without anything, and they thought they were going to die. So what did Christopher Columbus do according to this record? He approached the locals, the indigenous people, and told them that if they did not give him food enough and let him go back to where he wanted to go, he would steal the moon from them. Okay? So, of course, the natives didn't give him anything. So that night, what happens? There is an eclipse of the moon. The moon disappears. And the natives freak out. Okay? And give him everything and he can leave. And he explains, I knew that there was going to be an eclipse because I learned that from the tables of Rabbi Zakutu.
Wow.
Rabbi Zakutu. Isn't that incredible?
Incredible indeed.
This is not a Jewish story. This is from the chronicles of the Columbus expeditions.
Well,
so anyway,
the response, Rabbi, has been amazing. People enjoyed this thoroughly. We're now going to let you go get your morning coffee, your breakfast. It's
Sure.
4 o'clock. It's 4 o'clock in the morning in Portugal. And God willing,
Yes, and
God willing, when things really get back to full normal, we'd love to have you in person in Montana. In the meantime, we're going to wish everyone a wonderful evening. God willing, in 10 days or so, we have another lecture coming up with Tova Mordechai. Stay tuned. And evangelical woman, pastor who became a religious Jew living in Tzvat. That's going to be our next lecture. Stay tuned. Sei gesund. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you very much.
okay.
And we'll see you
Thank
back
you.
soon.